All right, all right. Hello and welcome all to the Business Solution Partners webinar about payment factories and why CFOs should be interested in them. My name is Craig Cook. I'm your host and the Chief Marketing Officer for Business Solution Partners. I'm joined today by Bob Stark, the Vice President of Strategy for Kyriba, and Hussain Zaidi, Chief Solutions Architect for Business Solution Partners. In just a minute, Hussein's going to jump in and introduce payment factories and provide you with some context to the conversation. Then I'll introduce Bob and lead him in a Q&A session exploring all that we'd like to learn today about payment factories. Now, we've got a lot to cover, and we'll probably maximize our hour. So if we don't get to everyone's questions, you can be sure that we're going to follow up with you later in the week and address everything that you may want to know about payment factories. All right, so once again, thank you for your attendance today. Let's jump in. It's my sincere pleasure to introduce our resident Kyriba expert, Hussain Zaidi.
Hi everyone, I'm Hussain Zaidi here at Business Solution Partners. Welcome to webinar about payment factories and why CFOs should know about them. Today, many organizations continue to manage their payment processing in bank accounts at business unit level or subsidiary level. While these methods may offer a degree of flexibility, at the same time, they can often result in poor visibility, high maintenance costs, and fraud. A payment factory is a centralized payments hub used to gain control and management over processing of decentralized payment flows. Whether they originate at the highest level in the company or at the sub-level, the key is getting control over these decentralized payment flows. The actual structure of payment factory can manifest in a number of ways, with internal factors such as processes, technologies, and staff, and external factors such as bank counterparties, connectivity, and account structures.
Oh, Hussain, thank you for that great introduction. That sums up exactly what we're here to talk about today, payment factories and why CFOs really want them. And now let's shift over to our special guest. I'm delighted today to be joined by Bob Stark, the VP of Strategy for Kyriba. Hey, Bob, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much. Appreciate that introduction. It's a good context to talk about payment factories for the rest of the session.
So, Bob, I have this mental image of these little bits and bytes toiling away in a digital payments factory to achieve our financial automation and validation goals. But during our prep for this webinar, you made a comment that I'd like to start out with. You said that payment factories are relatively new in the United States, but are more fundamental to European and Asian markets. Why does that seem to be the case?
Well, it's a good question. A lot of it has to do with the types of payments that we see in North America. In North America, for the last 20 years, we've had the privilege, because it's a very large market, of having many suppliers and many payment processes actually very domestic. And so we've been able to get away with US dollars, a world-accepted currency, and not having to do cross-border payments as much. We have the privilege of connectivity to very large banks being direct, as opposed to requiring very disaggregated systems and having technologies like SWIFT. There's a lot of different factors like that in Europe, they've had to deal with a multi-currency environment, multiple systems, multiple countries, all that stuff that we just don't necessarily see in North America nearly as much. So it's been a trend of late, and we'll get into some of those reasons why, but the main reason has to first be the technology, the processes, and the fact that America is just a very large market that didn't need to have a lot of complexity around payment.
Got it. So as the world becomes more global, I guess what we're finding relevant to corporate finance teams in other parts of the world is increasingly important for U.S. companies. That's a great point. I'd like to take a minute here to just let everybody in the webinar know that this is an interactive webinar, and please feel free to use the comment and the chat tools to provide us with feedback and ask questions, which we'll lob over to Bob over the course of the hour. If something's on your mind, just let us know through the webinar chat tools. Okay, so let's get started here, Bob. What is a payment factory? What are all these little digital gremlins twirling around making payments more efficient?
That's a great way to put it. I like the twirling around visual. This visual on this slide may not be quite the same as what you're describing, but I'm going to start at the very basics. A lot of times when we think of payment, there's a variety of different groups and systems that would initiate payments, but for the most part, the global payments that come out of an organization going to suppliers for M&A, or even just moving cash around within the organization's bank structure, they typically come out of two groups. One is going to be, let's say, AP, which is typically some sort of ERP. Put a couple of examples here of those. And then another one is going to be Treasury. Typically, we see supplier, low-value types of payments coming from the ERP, ones that are paying invoices and whatnot. And then Treasury oftentimes has a slightly higher amount of money, maybe a lesser volume of payments coming through. And we would expect to see them maybe reaching the same banks, but not having necessarily the same exact requirements. But as you can see in this diagram illustrates it, there's this concept of duplication. Maybe it's not exactly the same banks, but we have overlap in terms of systems that are connecting to banks, and that creates some inefficiency and some opportunity for improvement. So taking a diagram like that and kind of going into this next slide, which really allows us to look at more of this concept of centralization. Now, centralization isn't the only aspect of a payment factory, but it's one of the most important ones that when we're looking at differences, and I'm glad you mentioned that at the start, Karen, that this idea of well, what's happening in Europe versus what's in North America. In North America, quite often, and historically, we haven't had the complexity around the technology side. We haven't had the types of payments that overlapped in the same way. We had a greater variety, both in Treasury, accounts payable, and things like that. And that led to need to centralize these more often. So in Europe, there's a larger percentage, well north of 50, more like 60, 70% of organizations have some sort of centralization, meaning going through this idea of a payment hub. That could be through the ERP system, it could be through the Treasury system, it could be a third party, leveraging some sort of service bureau. I mean, there's a lot of different facets to this, but the central point that is relevant here is that those payments are centralized through something which creates some efficiency around that connectivity and communication to the banks. There's other things that happen, and that's where we get the factory part. So it's not just a payment centralization, like moving everything through a payment hub and then onto the bank, but it's a little bit more in terms of value added of some of that information. When I say value added, it's determining the optimal way and methodology and format and type of payment, perhaps even optimizing the banks that it should be going through. It's trying to make those choices more efficient. So partly it's just centralizing and creating some efficiency around communication to banks, but the other aspect is determining what is the best connectivity and format to get the information to the bank. Obviously, we have a concept of cost. Every time you send payments, it costs you some sort of money. If it's a wire, it's more expensive than an ACH, as an example. And so we want to be able to leverage this idea of efficiency when we're producing or the value added to a payment. We want to be able to route that in the most efficient possible manner. So that idea of routing, there's a number of different ways to do it, but thinking of what we looked at in the last diagram, there's a blind routing, which basically means that it comes out of these systems, comes out of Treasury, comes out of ERP in a very pre-approved manner. There's not a lot of extra work except to centralize the connectivity to the banks. So you send information to the banks, it's pre-approved in, say, the ERP system as an example. It's pre-formatted to whether it's an EDI format or XML or Swift-based, whatever the necessitated that the bank needed to be able to move that payment onwards and transmit the funds. That's all done in the system. There's no additional work for the payment factory to be able to do. There's also receipt of payment acknowledgements, and it's really just a two-way street. Send payment files, get acknowledgements back. The dynamic routing, and there's different words for this. I call it dynamic. You can call it intelligent routing. You can call it value added. Kind of thinking of the factory concept that you mentioned a little bit ago. And that's where you see some of this added value come. I didn't put it in a picture, but put it in words to help understand what's similar between the two options, but really where some of this value added comes into play. So the first one you see is top right. Instead of things being pre-approved and pre-formatted, you have this option for additional approvals. You have the ability to create and generate the appropriate format for the bank requirements, which, if you think about it, if you're having to pre-format to the bank requirements, that's an exercise for someone. Maybe it's a CIO's group, maybe it's finance, maybe it's a system provider, but there's work that has to be done there. And if the payment factory can add that on, that can very much simplify the process, especially when we have standards emerging like XML 2022, which is a mouthful to say, but it's also not a single format. It's basically a format, almost a guideline, which has many, many hundreds of thousands of different variations based on the type of payment, where it's going, where it came from, all this sort of remittance information that helps get the payment pushed along so the bank knows what it is. That's a payment format. Like, for example, on our side, we deal with customers, we have like 10,000 different payment scenarios or payment format variations. Like, it's a very big number, even though technically you could say there's one different format. So that's a big piece of it, this format generation, as well as making sure that the appropriate controls and approvals are there to have the right payments being approved by the right people within your workflow.
So, Bob, you're cutting out a little bit. If you can adjust your microphone, that would be great. In the meantime, I'd like to talk about what the components of a payment factory are. I mean, we'll get into why it's done, but I'd like to build a bridge between these two concepts once you walk us through what's in a payment factory, the component parts.
Absolutely. And so this slide actually gives a good example of the different components of what we'd expect in a payment factory. So I break it into 4 different categories. Workflow, the security, which is these days, unfortunately, very, very, very important because of the need to prevent against fraud and cybercrime in payment workflows, the connectivity, and then what I call that format transformation or format generation. So the workflow is pretty straightforward. You would expect some sort of dashboard. You'd expect some sort of screening, such as OFAC here in the US or EU or UN lists, like these screening watch lists that banks have to do from a compliance standpoint. We would want to have those, obviously, within a payment system, so you can do that yourself and not have to wait for the bank. You would want some sort of fraud monitoring, real-time detection, conditions, rules, make sure you're not sending payments to North Korea as an example, like that, these sort of conditions that you build into the workflow. You need the integration of acknowledgements, both positive and negative, like basically rejected payments, so that you have all of that within your workflow. And there's a few other things like oversight and workflow changes. Sometimes you want bank balance reporting to see real time what actually cleared the bank. But generally there's a workflow component, and all of these are really just to help you understand what's happening. Is it within the compliance and controls that I have set up for my payment process? And the dashboard to oversee that. So that's generally what we say. When we say workflow, we're thinking of what oversight do we have across all our payments? What visibility and transparency do we have? Okay, I'll talk quickly about security and connectivity and format transformation, then we can talk a little bit about what those things mean. Security, 3 different categories. 1, application security. Is your system protected? Number 2, is the data secure? And then number 3, the authentication, which is everything from encryption, digital signatures, just making sure that the file en route is actually protected in the right way, so encrypted in the right way, have digital signatures, etc. The connectivity is pretty straightforward. I think most on the phone would know that. There's Swift, there's host-to-host connections. We have this prevalence of APIs, which is starting to filter into the banking community. So whatever the right way, the best way to connect to that, expect your payment factory would be able to not only have those options, but be able to choose the appropriate channel in order to make costs more efficient. The format transformation, that's pretty simple stuff. It's logically, you're just sending the format that the bank said they want to see it in. And you would expect your payment factory to be able to create the appropriate format for the type of payment, for the bank, and obviously for the type of connection and routing that you expect out of that particular payment. So if it's going from, say, your accounts in Luxembourg to payment for a supplier in Thailand, you want to make sure that the appropriate format is pre-developed and pre-assigned. You don't want to have to do any work on the user side to actually make that happen. So I know there's a lot of stuff there, but that's pretty much what we expect when we talk about what is a payment factory and what's within it to make it all work.
How do these conversations emerge when you're talking to the enterprise? I mean, clearly all of these issues are things that the CFO and the treasurer are dealing with, but is there something in particular that creates the interest in wanting to streamline payment management, in going down this road?
Yeah, there is, and it depends organization to organization. It used to be more of an efficiency discussion, if that makes sense, in the sense that they were spending too much money. They were internally managing this through CIO's team, through IT, and self-building some of these things like the connections to the bank, the systems, the bridges to make it all happen. But as we have the need for greater controls, especially with this rising threat of fraud and cybercrime, it's put this security requirement as really front and center, and making sure that the right monitoring, the right detection, the right controls in the first place to prevent the right people and not the wrong people from entering and approving payments, that tends to be the leading concern now. So most CFOs, what keeps them up at night, so to speak, is how do I ensure that I'm not sending funds to the wrong person, whatever the BEC scheme or social engineering or inadvertent mistakes that might lead to that.
And there is a lot of opportunity for that. Where do compliance and regulatory issues sit in this equation? Is that part of the security component or perhaps another layer?
It depends on the organization. Generally, I like to suggest that it's probably another layer. I mean, security is obviously, it's important and it can encompass a number of different things. But in some cases, if we're talking about external compliance, that's a different set of rules that you might need to follow over and above just making sure that you have the right people doing the right thing within your payments work. Some organizations are more regulated than others. There's certain industries and verticals, such as the financial space and insurance, that have more rules that they need to follow. Everything around how they can send payments within their own accounts to what they need to do for external regulation. And obviously the banks is a whole different scenario altogether, for the simple reason that they have an immense amount of regulation. Things like payment screening are things that they're legally obligated to do, whereas a corporate, maybe it's more of a nice to have.
Got it. Let's shift gears a little bit now and dig into some of the reasons around why CFOs are keen on payment factories. Tell me, what's driving the conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. So this slide gives us an overview of what those different, opportunities are. Why do CFOs care about this? Because in many cases, you can make the argument, well, the CFO's concern is more about making sure that the efficiency is in the finance team, within the Treasury team, those sorts of operations within the organization, and the CIO's job is to make these things more efficient. Well, the CFO and CIO typically have an alignment for all of these different reasons: costs, risk reduction, visibility, and then scalability. I want to talk through all of those because I think they're important, Karen, for the audience. Cost savings, as we mentioned, is the very first one, and this is one I know you and I have talked about before. What are these cost savings? Well, the reason why there's a cost saving is twofold. One, there may be inefficiency in the way that payments are being sent. And the second part is it may be inefficiency in terms of the way that it was managed, such as having internal IT support to build FTP connections to banks or build formats out of the ERP system and actually engage internal resources to not just build those the first time, but maintain that every time a bank offers a new format or there's a new type of payment to a new country that's required. These sorts of things incur work, and if it's done internally, those costs can be immense. I put a quote here at the bottom as an example, but those numbers can be much, much higher depending on the organization.
All right, so let's talk about what's actually involved in pulling the trigger on a payment factory. Making these direct connections possible means that a lot of internal processes and structure needs to be rethought, and new strategies need to be brought to the table. Is that right?
It usually should be. Now, I say it in that cautious way for the simple reason that sometimes you're really just trying to take your good structure and maybe outsource that so that you're not having IT take care of all those changes, because maybe that's holding you back from having maybe a single global format like XML. Or you may find that, look, we like our controls, we like our process, we just want to make sure that we save money because we're trying to allow the CIO's group to be more scalable and more strategic to the organization and not just support making software changes. So there is that possibility, but for the most part, the structure itself is not necessarily right. The banks that you're using may not necessarily be right. The ways that you're setting up your controls and who gets to do what may not necessarily be right, and that's where we get into some of these other advantages beyond just simple cost savings.
I'd imagine that with the cost savings and the streamlining, there are efficiencies in flows too, payment flows. These can be upgraded or managed more carefully, right?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of times just the simple concept of netting payments It doesn't necessarily have to be a very sophisticated multilateral netting program like we see the Treasury team within the organization doing, but it could just be simply we are sending 4 or 5 or 10 or 50 payments to the same supplier. Maybe there's an opportunity to reduce the amount of payments that are going out, but we don't know that until we have this overall visibility, which actually kind of gets into that point. I guess get forward to number 3, just because I think this slide answers your question really well. By centralizing those payments in that single system, in that single workflow, you get that visibility to understand, am I sending too many payments? And I centralize that and slim that down so I can actually take 10 payments down to 1. It's a good question, and I think this definitely answers that.
Wow, that's great. So I'd like to go back to risk for a minute. We've talked a bit about this, but is risk not one of the significant drivers of CFO behavior now, and bringing more people into this conversation about payment factories?
Yeah, unfortunately, and I say that a couple of times in this presentation. I hate the fact that fraud and cybercrime is such a problem. It would be obviously better for all of us if that wasn't the case, but it's the reality. And there's a couple of different things around risk that are very important to CFOs. The first one, and it's just a blanket statement, but the more systems you have, having a standardized set of controls around your payments is just really difficult to do. I said impossible. I guess basically it's not impossible, but it's really, really expensive and really, really difficult because you have to have the exact same process set up across 2, 3, 4 different systems. Never mind the duplication and whatnot that we talked about a few moments ago. So what that means is that you do have a need to be able to have better transparency and a better set of controls, which is everything from how are payments being approved to what sort of encryption do we have, what sort of authentication do we have, what sort of review of acknowledgements do we have. The more central that is, the easier it is to ensure that it fits within the process and policy that you've set up for payments for the entire organization. Oftentimes what we find, and I think you know this from when we talked before, is that when we have multiple systems, we end up having multiple policies. And that's not ideal. We want one policy for the organization, no matter where it is, no matter where the payment might be, whether it's domestic, whether it's international, whether it's low value, whether it's high value. We want a policy that covers all of that and then have the ability to implement that, which becomes difficult when we're fragmented across systems.
If we were talking about this a couple of years ago, I would say bullet point number 3, or internal fraud, external hacking, these would be less of a concern. But the trend today seems to be towards more vulnerability. Is that at the top of the list now?
Definitely top of the list. Unfortunately, I think that's the 3rd time I've said it now, but it's true. It's so unfortunate. But every time that there is an instance, whether it happened to an organization or just somebody that they knew, 1 or 2 degrees of separation away, it really becomes a wake-up call to how do we make sure this doesn't happen to us. And all the surveys in the world all point to the same thing: fraud is increasing. And even if they're not successful, the attempts are basically somewhere in the order of 70-75% of organizations see attempts for payments fraud. So it's not like it's not happening to us. It is. The level of protection obviously needs to increase because, as we know, these schemes get more and more sophisticated all the time. And so, yes, you're right. That becomes paramount. And that's, of all these different issues, it usually is the top of any list.
Yeah, we're going to drill down on that in just a minute, but I'd also like to get to scalability. It's not just that aspect, but also the flexibility and the agility that the modern CFO wants in managing their relationships across the enterprise, right?
Yeah, it's a great point to make. And we'll say it's oftentimes 2nd or 3rd on the list, not 1st, because unfortunately protecting against payment fraud is always number 1. But it's very high on the list because a lot of CFOs are finding that they're almost held hostage to the banking relationships that have been set up because of the immense amount of work to maintain, we'll say, the technology that links to those banks, that works with the ERP. I mean, they don't really want to open up the process. It's almost like a let sleeping dogs lie scenario because it becomes hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to change a banking relationship for the simple reason that we found a bank that maybe works more locally for us. We expanded as an organization, and maybe we'd like to not have to make cross-border payments from the U.S. to maybe our expansion into Europe or Asia. We'd rather leverage local cash pools and local payments to reduce the cost because now we have so much more payments activity, but we're held hostage to the fact that our technology was so difficult to implement from ERP to bank, and the amount of IT effort required, and we don't really have those resources anymore than when it was first built, and we just find that the scalability and flexibility aren't there. So whether it's changing banks, whether it's adding new relationships, or whether it's just globalizing and centralizing and simplifying the formats that are used. The formats that we use to send payments 5 years ago are different than what they are today, but yet many organizations aren't moving to XML despite the efficiencies it offers, simply because the technical effort in an internal implementation is just immense. That's the kind of thing what we're talking about with scalability.
So, Bob, I'm curious as to where you're seeing interest. Describe the profile of the enterprise. Is there a threshold in terms of size or number of payments? Just give us an idea of the size of the breadbox here.
Well, every organization sends payments. So any CFO, whether it's a multi-billion-dollar organization, whether it's a Fortune 100 organization, or whether it's an organization that's really just starting to become a little bit more complex, maybe because they just expanded out of the U.S., or they just expanded their supplier base and suddenly have a few more mouths to feed when it comes to paying invoices. It doesn't matter how big the organization is, you're going to have these needs, and if you have these needs, you want to find an efficient way. What we find, interestingly enough, and it's not surprising at all, is that these smaller organizations that maybe are maybe 50, 100 million that are starting to just get that level of that tipping point where it becomes a little bit more complex, and they don't want to wait until it gets too big to manage. They look at the best practices. They look at what the Ubers of the world and the Googles of the world are doing and think, I need to do that now, because if I don't, then I hold myself back and I actually limit the growth of the business by not having the right structure in place. So the tipping point is different for different organizations, but we certainly find that the smaller growing organizations tend to emulate the best practices that have already been trailblazed by larger companies.
All right, here's the big question. So what does it mean to say, okay, I want a payment factory? What happens when someone says, this sounds great to me, I'm ready to dive in? What are the next steps?
Sure. Well, first things first, you need to understand where the pain is. If I go, I'll just track back a couple slides because I want to go to that component one that we had a moment ago. So if you look at all these different things, not every organization needs help across all of these different aspects. There may be organizations and people on the phone that are thinking, oh, well, I only have 2 banks. And I may have 3 banks next year, but for now I only have 2. So there may be a lot of this that is not as important, but then they look at something like fraud monitoring or maybe having better authentication of payments and think that's actually the thing I need. So you start by understanding where are my needs, which is to be said for any software or technology project. That's not unique to what we're talking about here. But just like a menu, you pick and choose the things that you want. If some organizations say, look, we're sending, our payment controls and our process and the way that we incorporate documentation, all that works fairly well for us, but where our problem is that we need to be able to send payments to banks automatically. Right now we're logging into banking portals. Then in their case, that connectivity, which is lower down on the slide, that may be the issue that they want to solve, and the rest of it will come over time as they increase their complexity in other parts of their payment. So it's understanding what is it that I want to solve, and then of course figuring out and being able to pick and choose the components of a payment factory that are relevant to them.
So now our CFO says to themselves, when I get down to it, I've decided control is my real issue. And having identified that issue, I want to take the next step. So what is that next step?
Do a little Google research, figure out who can provide the specific features that support that, and then go talk to them. I mean, I'm making it sound very simple, but that's really what you want to be able to do, is what can solve this particular problem, my suggestion always is that think of more than what you want right now. Think of your requirements down the road. So these components of a payment factory, it's a good chance that if you're a growing organization, let's just say you're a small organization right now, but you'll be a $1 billion company in 3 years. Think of what your requirements can be in 3 years so you don't make a decision now that limits your ability to scale and grow, kind of like we were talking about a few moments ago. So if you limit yourself too much, then you get a solution that solves for today, and then literally tomorrow, it actually is holding you back and not helping you nearly as much.
So, Bob, let's get down to some nitty-gritty here. Is this something that takes a long time to deploy? I mean, let's acknowledge the X factors of company size and change management, et cetera. But is this direction something that takes months and years to plan and implement, or can we get up and running with payment factories quickly with an eye towards scalability? Explain that to me.
Oh, it can be as simple as weeks. I mean, there's aspects of this that are very small. If all you're looking for is, I just want a payment dashboard and be able to set some rules to monitor my payment activities so I know what's happening, that's a days to weeks kind of process. If you're looking to, I want to change out my connectivity and I actually want to implement a SWIFT structure, be able to implement controls and acknowledgments around what actually is happening, not just sending to the bank, but also receiving back, then you're probably looking from weeks to months because then you're actually working with connecting to your banks a little bit differently. So it doesn't require a tremendous amount of internal effort, and I think that's one of the big advantages that we're talking about here is that you don't need to have a 6 or 9 or 12-month project with IT and get on their schedule. You're actually recognizing that you don't have those kind of resources available, and you're looking to say, I would like to find some sort of technology that actually allows me to benefit from this, but not require the immense amount of effort that these things used to take before the cloud was a thing.
Bob, can you take us into the fraud dimension that is growing in importance as a decision-making factor for payment factories? Help us understand how it solves for that problem.
If you look at a slide like this, and this gives a couple of different samples, the AFP was one, and there's a couple other sources too. They all say pretty much the same thing. Fraud's on the increase. It increases every year, and even if it's just attempted fraud, somebody's trying to take your money. And if somebody's trying to take your money, we want to have the best possible protection against that, because if they become more innovative, which is what all the cybersecurity experts continue to say and warn us about, then we need to become more innovative too. If they understand the barriers that prevented that attempted fraud, then they will find ways to circumvent those barriers. So we need to build new barriers.
Some of these popular phishing, social engineering, hacking schemes, they're increasingly popular, and they're growing in sophistication and effectiveness. I mean, I've personally been on the receiving end of some very clever attempts. I recall receiving a spoof email that said, please pay this invoice to supplier X. And the invoice numbers look right, and the format is correct, and it actually looked like an official release from one of our payees, but we subsequently found it to be completely fraudulent. Does a payment factory help to stave off attempts like this?
Well, you have to find the process that does it. And the answer is, if you, in this particular example, the slide I have, that falls within point number 2. It's not that someone's trying to hack into your systems in that particular scenario, these BEC schemes. It's that someone's trying to get you to go off process. They're trying to take advantage of the fact that simply an email changing the account number is enough to actually change the account number and then pay what was your supplier's bank account and now is someone else's bank account. Or it's the CEO unquote that just got on an airplane and is unavailable by cell phone to validate anything and says you need to send this right now, and maybe it's because there's a merger that's actually really in the works, but again, the bank account information that's provided doesn't align with what it really should be. So a lot of that is within point number 2. It's not to say that the rest are unimportant, we'll go through those, but a lot of it is around controls and process. And the key thing we say over and over and over again is that that separation of duties, those controls must be consistent across every scenario. because what we find with these DEC schemes is a lot of them are not that email that you get, or maybe it's a phone call sometimes because we've seen those as well, but that communication you get from an unauthorized party, you know, pretending that they're someone that they're not, that's usually not the very first attempt. It's not the first communication. It's not the first feeling out of your control to see if it'll work. And quite oftentimes we found that there's a lot of social engineering that happens behind the scenes to get that information. They've done things like they've listened to their earnings calls. They've seen emails from the CFO as an example, or CEO, and realized not just the patterns of information, but the mannerisms in which they speak, because oftentimes the way we speak is how we write emails these days. So they've done a tremendous amount of research to profile you and your organization and how you do payments. And so they may realize through hacking or maybe through other social engineering, they may come up with a scenario that understands that if there's an urgent payment that needs to go out the door, that it's handled differently than maybe a supplier payment for a regular invoice. Or we may have that payments in the U.S. are very well controlled and we have good process there and can review documentation and check with a certain set of people. If say the CEO or CFO is not available in an urgent situation, they have those checks and balances in place. But what we may not have is the same process in place in Asia because we have less people over there. Or we may treat low-value payments under a certain threshold differently than high-value payments. And that threshold, let's just say it's under $100,000, it may mean that a $99,000 or $999 payment is treated a little bit differently and less stringently than something that's a little bit bigger. Just because it's a lower dollar doesn't mean that a thief isn't interested in getting that amount of money. Any of us would be happy to receive a $99,000 payment. That means the cyber criminals are interested in that too. They're not as interested as the $5 or $10 million payment, obviously. Those are the bigger targets, but the fact is that it's kind of like, you know, we think with credit cards. Sometimes when your credit card gets stolen, it's not, they don't go to Best Buy right away and buy big screen TVs or try to buy a car or something. They will actually do a lot of small purchases just to see if you and or the credit card company are paying attention. We've seen the same kind of scenarios here, where if they gain unauthorized access to accounts or a stream of accounts, that they'll just test it just to see if the reconciliation process works. And if it doesn't, then those payments get bigger and bigger. So that's where we say consistency and standardization is incredibly important to ensure that all the controls and the process and the policy are enacted no matter what the scenario.
Wow. It's sobering as we're reviewing these points, 1 through 6 here, and the examples that you just described of hackers socially engineering their way into your business, these vulnerability points of entry.
It is. It's even more sobering when you think of the fact that there's some examples that we've seen and heard and have been publicized in the media where it's not just emails, it's phone calls too, where voices are being impersonated because there's certain people within the organization, especially for publicly traded companies, where their voice is effectively public information. You want to see a transcript for a public company on their earnings call, there's voices on that. They're typically the people that you would want to impersonate that if you can do that successfully, might actually trick someone into sending a payment they weren't supposed to. So when we talk about sophistication and innovation in cyber criminals, that's kind of what we're talking about. And so as a result, this need for controls is so high to be able to combat that.
So Bob, I know if I'm researching payment factories or any of the nomenclature around these types of solutions, Kyriba is going to come up and be on the top of the list. But I'm interested in understanding who are the people who are doing these searches, who are reaching out to you? What's the profile of the customer who is searching for these solutions? Who's asking for help? Is it the CFO, a finance team member? Who takes ownership of this project within the organization?
Well, it's a good point. Usually, there may be a bit of bottom-up communication. It may be someone at a conference saw something. So it could be someone in Treasury as an example. It could be someone in AP, like a NOTCHA conference as an example. It could be someone looking at your website that, looking for resources and sees payments.com and go, okay, wait a second, that's something that I need to be able to look at. But in terms of approval, It's generally these days a collaboration between the CIO and CFO. Depending on the organization, that may be a CISO as well that's involved, just depending on where those responsibilities lie. But CFO owns payments, CIO, CISO, CTO, depending on the C-level role they're at the organization, they will own technology. And you'll have the information security side will own the information security policy and procedures of the organization. They're the ones that are protecting workflows. They're the ones that are protecting systems from many of the things on this slide, actually. The CFO is the one that's responsible for the money going out the door. So as a result, it really is a collaboration between those two, and it may be one or the other that holds it, but these kind of projects typically don't happen without the blessing and the involvement of their teams. And yeah, they can, there's a lot of different ways to go about it. There's all sorts of events, all sorts of everything on the web. I mean, realistically, when any of us look at something, whether you're looking for a refrigerator or a car or a payment solution, you're going to go online and research a little bit, and you're going to come up with your names that fit the profile and support your payment requirements that you're trying to solve. But it's usually that top part of the organization. And, you know, these are big projects because if you think about it, the risk of not getting this right is very, very high and increasing. So if there is some sort of significant fraud attempt, or hopefully not, but a successful fraud occurrence, that hits the attention of not just the people we talked about, but the CEO and the board and probably shareholders as well.
Bob, as the CFO going down this road towards making a decision, what are some of the pitfalls that need to be considered in the top of mind? Things that you need to cover before they become an issue down the line from a strategic perspective.
Yeah, I have some high-level points on this, which I'll just skip to. I think the main thing is if you don't know what you're looking for and what are the point looking to solve, then you're not going to get what you're thinking of. You need to understand your own process. You need to understand, the slide I was showing a moment ago, what your exposure points are. If you know where you're exposed and you know where some of the problems are, then that allows you to be very targeted and surgical around what specifically you're implementing to plug those holes. It's very easy to say, look, we need to replace our entire payments process, but that's a very difficult process. It's a very expensive kind of project. And going back to your question several moments ago around just days, weeks, months, years kind of thing, you can get into a project that takes years if you want to replace everything. Overall business transformation is probably more than most CFOs and CIOs are willing to consider at this point, especially when they're looking to say, look, I'm happy with most of my payments process, but I'm not happy with the way that we're dealing with fraud, and we need better controls in place. So that's why I say it's important to be able to know what exactly do I need and what exactly do I not have. And then you can treat this kind of process as a menu approach. You can pick and choose the things that are relevant to you now and know that maybe there's other aspects down the road, but you can be very specific with what you need today.
From your experience, how many organizations are looking at the payment factory process not as a rip and replace for current systems, but as a more of an integrated experience, leveraging in-use technologies and adding a layer of insights to drive future change?
Well, the good answer is many more than there used to be. And I think that's part of the reason, especially here in the U.S., that most organizations weren't necessarily adopting it in the past. We didn't have the privilege of the proliferation of cloud and the acceptance of cloud as a good kind of tool to reduce risk. It was always something that was riskier 5-10 years ago. Now that we have cloud systems, we actually have the choice in front of us to be able to then solve those problems. So because we have that more often than not, and I would say just as an average, 60-70% of the time at least, you're finding these very surgical, very targeted types of technology projects which are just saying, I need something that, yes, plugs into my infrastructure. I need something that connects to SAP or Oracle or whatever my ERP is and integrates well with that, but I need it just for this thing. So I can afford to have just a best-of-breed solution for this particular area. And we're seeing that much more often. I think it's really the CIOs and CISOs really acceptance of the cloud and then moving to the cloud has created that comfort level that I'm actually reducing risk and not making it worse by going down that path. And that opens up the avenue for the types of solutions that you can integrate. It doesn't have to be just, oh, well, it has to be something within our ERP. We need to spend a couple million to find a way to make it work. It's, I can be very targeted and extremely efficient with what I'm spending to get there.
It's a bit surprising to me that fraud is such a large driver today. I would think that cost savings would be an equally important consideration, especially in this economic environment. I mean, corporations are reining in costs wherever they can. There's a real cost savings to be had with payment factories, whether it's the consolidation of banking relationships or the avoidance of duplication and so forth. Is this still important today?
It is still important. We downplay it a lot when we talk about some of these overarching issues, like we need scalability, we need payment fraud protection, all of these things, which are important. If you ask a CFO or a CIO or even a CEO, what are the most important priorities for them around making payments more effective and more efficient and better protected? And they'll list a number of things. Cost won't necessarily be in those top three, but when you actually get into the project, there has to be an ROI. There always has to be an ROI. That has always been the case as long as we've been in the space, and it always will be the case. And there are opportunities to save money as well as enable things that can help protect against things like fraud and allow more flexibility. So there's an enablement component, which helps with an ROI, but there's also just plain simple cost savings. There's money that's spent based on internal resources as well as even external costs that can be rationalized. So the answer is yes, but it's funny that it ends up not being the first priority when you ask someone what their interest is. But when it comes to the end of the project or even the middle, when it needs to be fully justified and approved at the end, then that's where cost rises way up the priority list.
Well, we all know fear is a great motivator.
It is a good motivator. I mean, that's if all you went to a CFO and just said, I can save you some money, and they say, I have 10 projects on my desk that can save me money. Why should I pay attention to this one? That's one of the main reasons that they care about it. But it's sort of okay, we will do it, but CFOs need more things to get their attention. And unfortunately, that's like this time. Unfortunately, fraud is one of those things that if you don't do it well, it's going to get your attention in the wrong way later on.
Bob, how do you see modern enterprises managing their payment factories? So, yeah, the CFO owns it, but who actually looks after the day-to-day business of the payment factory?
Good question. Usually it's more than one party. And I say more than one party. There's some organizations that have, like a shared services payment on behalf of type of operation. In that case, you're going to find whichever group or department is managing that, which is oftentimes within the CIO's group. You're going to find that they're managing that. In many cases, you're going to find that also there's resources within the controller's team, which obviously reports to the CFO, such as AP, that are going to be part of it. You're going to find Treasury plays a big role as well. So the treasurer has a vested interest in making sure the payment factory is meeting their needs, because one of the things that you have, and I think it was on the prior slide as well, where you go through some of these key things that a payment factory does, is that when you have a payment factory, and especially where it's, you can see at the bottom, like a payment on behalf of model, then you introduce other aspects to that. The moment you're paying on behalf of other entities within your organization, you suddenly have intercompany and in-house banking that needs to be done to ensure that from an accounting perspective, you're actually crediting the appropriate entities in terms of who's paying on behalf of them. So that involves Treasury, and it involves the controller's team as well, because the accounting needs to be done in sync with these types of payments. So if you think about the overall of what are we doing in the payment factory, well, one of the key things we're doing is we're centralizing payments. And many times when we're centralizing payments, we're doing it on behalf of other entities. We're centralizing that to maybe a holding company or something along those lines where it's centrally administered. And therefore, we need Treasury, we need accounts payable, we need the controller. We need a variety of different groups that are involved. And one of those may be managing it, but given that there's a technology component, we see it as often within the CIO's group as we do within the CFO's team.
All right, so CFOs are famous for asking for the ROI of any given solution. So let's say the CEO comes to our CFO and says, what's the ROI of doing this? I mean, you've provided some anecdotes, but how is that question generally addressed as part of the evaluation process?
Yeah, well, hopefully, I can't speak for everyone, but hopefully it's done in a very direct way where you simply look at, here's what you're going to get out of it, here's the payback you expect based on the benefits you're going to see, and ideally it's presented in a way that shows that payback and ROI is going to be something that is significant and a payback within months as opposed to years. If it's something that's years, I mean, if we're being pretty honest about this, that's not a project that's going to happen. It's not prioritized. That's just not good enough in today's world. You expect something that's going to be very quick, very simple, and very compelling. So the CFO is asking for it, and they should be because they're CFOs and they think that way. But for an organization, you shouldn't be going down this path if there's not a good ROI. If you're not able to reduce those costs, if you're not able to enable other things for the business, such as being more efficiently, being able to conduct business in other markets, such as overseas, as an example, and you're not able to put adequate protection to prevent fraud, which has maybe a more difficult ROI, but still one that can be measured. If you're not able to prove those things, then you really haven't figured out why you're doing this, is always my assertion. The ROI kind of proves that you're actually doing the right thing.
So we have this term payment factory. Is this shorthand for something that CFOs and treasurers are looking for in terms of services? In other words, what are some of the synonyms for payment factory?
Yeah, there is different words and vocabulary that's used around, and I've actually used a few of those even just in this presentation today. So payment factory is one. We have payment centralization. We have payment on behalf of, which is part of a shared services model. Sometimes they'll just say, we need to get better at payments or be more efficient global payment structures. So the terminology is not specific. Payment factory is one that's very easy to say and easy to remember, so it tends to be used quite a bit, but by no means is it the only thing that describes what we're talking about.
Got it. So how do you see this concept of payment factory evolving? Obviously, the complexities of managing the various dimensions of your financial health is changing as fraud continues to take its toll and shifting regulatory requirements motivate change. But are there things that, even as you look at it today, are evolving and changing the components of what a payment factory is?
Yeah, there actually is. There's actually three, I'll say, trends. I hate to use the word trends, but anyway. One of those is this movement towards instant payments. And that affects maybe more the Treasury side than the accounts payable side of an organization. But there is an acknowledgement that there's more instant payments. I mean, SWIFT, with their global payment initiative, has gone down the path of trying to have same-day settlement of cross-border payments. You have SEPA instant payments. We have same-day ACH that we've already seen in the U.S., and we expect to have more instant versions of that going forward. So there's the timeliness of payments is increasing, which is important because CFOs want to be able to leverage that as much as they can from a cost and efficiency standpoint. The second part, which I think is pretty important, is the actual technology itself. So why is the technology important for payments? Well, we hear things like blockchain, distributed ledger technology, and there's a variety of other reactions to that. But what it means, and I put APIs in this discussion because we've seen a lot of promotion of banks extending APIs into their systems. Part of that is regulatory in Europe. But part of that is just the fact there's new technology to enable better communication with banks. What that means is that we will, in the next few years, have even greater proliferation of other ways to send money to third parties around the world. And we already see some examples of this. I mean, you go to any payment conference, you're going to find organizations and fintech providers that are saying, we can do payments in a different way. We can send it not via the bank, but maybe via PayPal, maybe via blockchain as an example, maybe via or a concentration where we send payments on behalf for you. These sorts of things will continue to proliferate with the kind of technologies that I talked about, especially APIs, which open up a whole new category of payment service provider, but also distributed ledger technology when it comes to fruition will create more categories of organizations that can send payments. What that will mean for a corporate CFO is that they may make decisions beyond their bank, and they choose to send payments in different ways. You would need then a payment factory to have the controls, the connectivity, all these things that we've been talking about. You need to make sure that those are in line to be able to do that. If you don't have all of that in place, then you're going to be held back because of your structure and your technology from taking advantage of those potentially lower cost ways to be able to send payments. So for me, that's what's evolving, is that the marketplace is evolving, the technology is evolving, and obviously the speed in which we're able to send and clear payments is evolving as well.
And that brings us back to fraud, and unfortunately all roads seem to lead back to fraud, right?
All roads do lead back to fraud, but the other aspect is that there always will be this component of making my process more efficient. And those two needs will continue to be the balance of what we're looking for to make payments better for organizations.
Well, Bob, we're winding down now, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you and everyone who attended here today once again. We've got some great resources available to you right away, and some additional resources that anyone who attended today can gain access to. First, I'd like to let everybody know that we're going to deliver to you an ebook right to your email inbox after this webinar today. The ebook is The Business Case for a Payment Hub, and this will help you organize your thoughts around and strategy towards this important process, maybe making those all-important first steps towards implementing a payment factory. Second, I'd like to point everybody to the Business Solution Partners website. We have a dedicated Kyriba page, as well as some additional downloadable assets and blog posts surrounding treasury management, fraud prevention, and other topics aligned with today's conversation. Finally, if you navigate to the Kyriba website, they too have a wealth of information available to you, all in exchange for just a bit of information about yourself and your business. I'd like everybody to know that we're going to have a recording of this webinar available on the Business Solution Partners website in just a few days. I personally think this has been a fascinating conversation, and it's provided us all with a great foundation for what payment factories are, why they're important, and how they can eliminate a number of stress points that CFOs have around payments. Well, Bob, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate it very much.
And thank you to all attendees. I'm going to hand the mic back over to Hussain, who will help us follow up with any questions from the audience with the time that we have left. Thank you, Hussain. Take it away.
Thanks, Craig. The floor is open now for questions. Seems like we have one question from the audience. The question is, does Kyriba support international payments and banks? So Kyriba can process both domestic and international wires. It supports bank and payments connectivity to over 2,000 banks worldwide, including SEPA in Europe and SWIFT Global Payments. So, you rest assured, wherever your banking relationships are, Kyriba can work with them.
Great. Hussain, I feel like we're really running out of time here. I know there's a couple of questions queued up from the audience, and I don't think we're going to have time to them. We're running right up to the end of the hour here. So on behalf of Business Solution Partners, thank you all for attending. We will make this recording available and follow up with some of the questions that we have on the back end of the webinar with everyone shortly. Thanks again for your participation. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Hussain. And everybody have a great day.